Paul, says, in Christ we are all one. There's no male and no female, no slave and no free. It's there's this sense of oneness in that pleroma, no definitions, but it can be kind of scary because you don't know what's what.
Mm-hmm.
You lose your identity, you lose your certainties about your individuality, you dissolve into the void, and that takes courage.
Murray Stein, welcome to the podcast. It's so nice to finally meet you.
Nice to be with you, Brian.
Well, we came together on the occasion of a new book published by Chiron called Ways to the Self that is a collaboration with a woman named Diane Stanley. How did this book come about? What was the inspiration?
Well, there are many sources. I've been a Jungian analyst for over 50 years. So thinking about the self and working with people on discovering the self and expanding the sense of self is, part of my daily work. I've written quite a bit about it in the past, and Diane came to me with a dream some years ago that I found, it's what we call a big dream, a wonderful example of a dream that takes you to an experience of the self. You can see it and experience it. So she and I collaborated on a number of things. We made a video in my office discussing her dream. You can look at it on YouTube. It's called the title slips me at the moment, Map of the Soul, the Self. If you Google Map of the Soul, the Self, and my name, you'll come to it. And so in the recording, we discuss her dream. She's in my office. She shows pictures that she's made. She's an artist. She's a painter. So she made a number of, I guess you could call them illustrations, or she worked with the dream in an artistic way, and she did some what we call active imagination with the dream. And so that was the beginning of our collaboration, her dream. And then she and I had quite a number of conversations about what we called liberation. And liberation is a word that is not used in Jungian psychology very frequently. Jung uses it occasionally when he's writing about Eastern texts and so on. But in Jungian analysis, we talk about individuation, which is a psychological, spiritual, developmental process, but not so much about liberation. But it's very similar to liberation in the sense that we try to liberate people from their addictions to certain types of thinking, or what we call their complexes, go in circles, anxieties, triggers, all of that. There's a kind of liberation project going on in Jungian analysis. And so she and I decided to have some conversations and record them. She has, you're going to interview her later, I know. She has a lot of experience with Tibetan Buddhism and Dogen and also psychedelics in her early years and trips to India. I didn't do all that. I took a trip to Zurich and trained as a Jungian analyst. That was my trip. But she's had a lot of experience in those areas. And so I was very interested in that, talking to her about that. And then she had Jungian analysis at the conclusion of all that. And she said that was a great assist for her to ground herself, because a lot of these other practices and so on kind of took her up into the air, and she lost contact with her history and her personal life, and what she calls the basement. So she became familiar with that. So that's all part of the work that we've done together. And then we took some of those recorded conversations and worked with them some more, and that became the basis of this book. And And there's also a chapter in the book of reflections on paintings that she made while she was in analysis. We don't go into the personal background of those paintings or the dreams that they grew out of, but we simply treat them as pictures of the individuation process or experience of the self. And as Jungians, we think about a process, that we're all in process. We're moving toward a goal of selfhood, and you could call it liberation, enlightenment, getting the bigger picture, putting ourselves into a perspective where we aren't the center of everything, where we're a part of everything, but we realize that in the inner world, the ego isn't the center, and certainly in the outer world, we have to pay respect to things that are, not under our control, but we're a part of our culture, our history, nature, all of that. So that's what we mean by the self. We're getting a sense of self. It's that bigger perspective. And these are chapters on working on that project.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I wanted to ask you was what do you mean when you talk about the self? It's just an interesting question for me to ask everyone who's a Jungian, because I think everyone adds a little bit of a different perspective or a different way to phrase it that may allow people to better grasp the concept, because it's a difficult one for most Westerners.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jung borrowed the term actually from Indian philosophy, the Atman. Mm-hmm. There's a small Atman and a big Atman, and that can be translated as self. It's rather confusing in Western English language anyway, because we use the word self in a kind of diminutive way, me, myself, and I, as a reference to basically ego. And sense of self expands that a little bit. I have a sense of myself, my identity, my history, where I come from, my memories. But when Jung uses the word self, he means something quite different from that. He means the totality of the psyche. And the totality of the psyche includes consciousness, ego consciousness, everything you know about yourself, all you've thought, all you can remember, and what he calls the unconscious, the unknown part of yourself, which has a indefinite extension. We don't know. Somebody once asked Jung late in life, where does the self end? What are the boundaries of the self? And he says, it's infinite. It has no boundaries. It's everything. So, but it's unknown. So it's that you could say if you experience the self, you experience a mystery. You experience something you can't really put into words very well, but it has a sense of numinosity to it. That's another word that Jung liked to use quite a lot. He borrowed that from a religious philosopher named Otto, Rudolf Otto, the idea of the holy, who came up with this term numinous. And the numinous experience is the experience of the holy or the divine. And Jung says, when you experience these levels of the personality in the unconscious, or what he calls the collective unconscious, the archetypal unconscious, you have the feeling that it's numinous, that it's sacred, that it's that's where the gods live, and they're a part of your soul. So that expansiveness, that's what attracted me to Jung. I was a student of literature and theology. I was at Yale Divinity School when I discovered Jung. I'd heard the name before, but I hadn't really paid any attention to it, and none of my professors did either. And then I was, by chance, introduced to Jung's Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and I've never put the book down. It's fascinating. And he writes in the introduction of the book, my life is all about the unconscious becoming conscious. This unknown, mysterious thing that it lies in the background, becomes consciousness in the course of a lifetime if we pay attention to it. So the self is that big, all-inclusive, and very indefinite, it's a reality that we live in. It doesn't live in us, we live in it. And it's very close, I think, to what, old-time religious people felt about their place in the cosmos. There is God, there is the sacred, the spiritual. We can participate in that. But this kind of sense of awe and Jung brought that into psychology. He was very interested in Gnosticism, which is rooted in that experience of the numinous and the greater reality, the invisible reality. And he translated that through his own experience first into psychological terminology. And his God word is self. That's the ultimate. Now, when you try to describe that, you get different experiences. People say, I experienced it like this. I had a vision. I saw something, extremely impressive, or the bright light, or all-inclusive reality, maybe on a drug trip, or in a moment of vision, or in a dream. That's what we write about in the book. There are these different pathways. And psychedelics is an interesting, I'm not a psychedelic, okay? I've never done psychedelics. I know lots of people who have. I don't, Jung didn't, but I don't discount it at all, because I've heard the experiences of people who have. And done under the right conditions, the right circumstances, the right psyche having the experience, it is a opener to what Jung called the self. So we talk about that in the book. That's how Diane got started on her trip to the self. I started with reading Jung and dreaming and being in analysis and doing active imagination. That's been my path. So that's another way. So we talk about these different ways in which one can have an experience of the self, and then importantly, what to do with that experience. It's one thing to have the experience, but then how to put it to work, how to live it, how to bring it into life in such a way that it is effective and useful to oneself and to the surrounding world. So we consider that issue also in our book. What to do with the experience if you have it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder, if that 1960s term, cosmic consciousness, isn't also a good example of what we're talking about when we're talking about the self. I mean, there's something about self, because of our Western ideas about it being the personal, to expand our concept of that into the impersonal. Part of that, I think, was the way the Upanishads were translated. The only word we had close to what they're talking about was self, but put a capital S on it to distinguish it from the small s self. But I think it's led to some kind of confusion. The self and the psyche, I think, are maybe sometimes still associated with the personal, like my greater self, my higher self, my psyche. But we're talking about something much more like the Brahman, or the Platonic idea of the nous, the great mind, something like that, right?
Absolutely. And Jung had all that in mind when he was writing about the self. That's his background. He studied all of that. He references it in his works. And I don't know how it came about, but also in the Jungian world, it kind of faded. The numinosity faded, and the practices became more personalized, because people who come in for analysis want psychotherapy, they want to fix, they want to feel better, they want to do better in life. And so the focus sort of shifted to how to work in a very personal way with your history, with your traumas, with your relationships. And in our relationship, as we work together, that has a transformative effect. So the emphasis sort of went to the personal and drifted away from the impersonal or the greater. And we're trying to bring it back, some of us anyway. I have a good friend and colleague, lives in Australia. You might want to interview him sometime. His name is also Stein, Leslie Stein. We are not related, but we have the same surname. And he's written a book called, I think, Jung on the Self in Jungian psychology, something like that. And he looked up every passage where Jung talks about the self, and he tries to explore the complexity of this concept. And you're right, Jung isn't a consistent philosophical thinker. He doesn't lay out concepts and then rigorously apply them and refine them. He's what he calls himself an empirical thinker. That is, he takes he grounds himself in experience. What's your experience? When he talks to a theologian, he doesn't want to know, what is your definition of God? What's your experience of God? Let's talk about that. Mm-hmm. What's your experience?
The phenomenology of it and the images that come with it. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then you can think about it. But first you have the experience. So when he collects experiences, as he does from many sources through world cultures, what he calls, archetypal investigations from every culture that he can find, and he starts reflecting on them. It isn't with the consistency of an Immanuel Kant or a Schopenhauer. It's with a kind of flexible mind, a William James mind. That's why I like Jung. I wrote a book called Jung's Map of the Soul, and that's what I say at the outset. Jung leaves space to think your own thoughts. He doesn't confine you to rigid definitions. He's not that kind of a thinker. He's more an empirical thinker, like William James was. He liked William James a lot. Varieties of religious experience. Let's talk to people about their experiences, respect them, and try to understand them, mm-hmm. and give them credit. So that's Jung's approach, and that's why it sometimes seems to contradict himself. Or, well, you said this over here. Why are you saying this? You have to read Jung like that with that in mind.
Yeah, I appreciate that about him too, and I think you have to go to the source text to realize that that's how he was working. He was making this sweeping survey of different mythological, spiritual systems, and kind of everything was up for grabs depending on the day and the context in which he was talking about something. But like with everything, people come along and they get fundamentalists and they want to systematize things. They want to make the diagrams and say, this is how it is and this is the name for that, which isn't true to, I think, Jung's spirit.
Not at all, no. Also, working in analysis, a good analyst will not do that. They might use a little terminology, but they, you're a student of James Hillman. You stick with the image, you let the image teach you something, you listen deeply, you might associate it to some concepts and ideas, but you don't confine the image or define the image. And then that image begins to speak to you, and you get much more out of the analytic experience when you treat a dream like that than if this means this and that means that, and now the dream is saying this to you, go and do that. Mm-hmm. Mechanical interpretations that you sometimes get from people. But I think it's a kind of poetry, actually, or an art, as we say. So there's a flexibility in it and a respect for what is presented. The presentation is important. Jung respected the presentation, didn't try to second guess the dreams. What is it hiding? Is it a disguise for something else? It says what it wants to say in its own language, and you understand it.
Hey, I want to take a moment to speak with you about this channel. Currently, only 11% of viewers are subscribed to the channel. I think those numbers are terrible. So if you're enjoying this content and you want to help out the channel, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe. And if you really want to help out the channel, you can become a member of the Howl in the Wilderness Patreon, which will give you access to early release of full ad-free episodes, plus access to the archive of the first 100 episodes of this podcast. It would really help me out and allow me to keep creating content like the interview that you're watching right now. Okay, thanks so much. Now, back to the interview.
So that's the approach, yeah.
So there is something in even the way that we approach a dream that could be part of the liberation project. So if I notice I have a tendency, every time someone comes and brings a dream to me of a house, I'm walking around the house and there's some doors that are locked and there's something in the basement that's scary, my mind automatically jumps to house as an image of the psyche, following Jung's famous dream of the house. And if I can catch that and stop myself from doing that and do like Hillman suggests and stick with the image, then that is like a kind of a liberation practice, a liberation from like fixed concepts and conditioning.
Yes. Those concepts are useful to a point, they give you some guidance and orientation. As concepts of the shadow, the anima, the animus, the structure, idea of the psyche. But it can also be a trap. So you have to use that. It's like an artist who uses paints. All artists use more or less the same paints. And those paints are very important. Those colors are very important. But how you blend them, how you use them, how you put them on the canvas is unique to each artist. And you have to treat a dream like that. It's a unique work. It comes from this person. It doesn't mean what it might mean to another person. And we need to get into that person's psychological framework and the feeling about that house. How do they feel about that house? What does that house remind them of? So you get these associations. You don't get concepts, you get associations, personal associations, and then amplifications can, what we call, it's a kind of mutual association to the dream objects and images. The amplifications that the analyst brings from studies, from knowledge of cultures and archetypal materials can enrich the image, but they can also lead you away from the image. Then you get more interested in the dictionary definitions of or examples, symbol dictionaries. But that, again, it can be a trap. So after the amplification, you come back to the individual. It always has to lead back into the individual's life experience and deepening that experience for that unique individual. We tend to look on people as unique individuals, even though we're all similar in many ways. But it often struck me as so surprising that I can walk through the streets of Zurich. I live in Switzerland now, and I love Switzerland. It's my home. And I think Zurich is the greatest city in the world. But I don't live in a city. I wouldn't want to live in a city. But if I walk down the streets of the Bahnhofstrasse in Zurich and I look at the faces on the street, I see no two faces alike. It's amazing. And I've gone there many times. Even twins look slightly different. How can that be? We all have one nose, two eyes, two ears. We're made of very few objects and components, and yet each face is different. So there's this uniqueness factor that we prize. And the more a person can get in touch with their uniqueness without feeling that they're the only person in the world, so unique, I'm so special. Everybody is unique. Mm-hmm. We're unique individuals among unique individuals, but it's a way of looking at people that gives them great value. And that's the way we treat our analysans, our clients in analysis. Each one is a unique and precious individual. That's why I went in, I was considering going into the ministry. My father was a Baptist minister, a pastor, and I was thinking about going into the ministry. I was actually ordained as a Presbyterian minister when I was young. I studied theology. And I decided to pursue analysis instead, working as an analyst, because you work with individuals. And when you work in groups, with groups of people like congregations, it becomes very political. It's always, this group against that group. Or, who's more special than the other one? And when you preach a sermon, you're preaching, I was taught at Yale Divinity School, when you look out at your congregation, think of them as sixth graders. Don't preach over their heads. That level, and you can't adjust it because it's a group level, the group mind. And then I discovered analysis and psychotherapy during my studies at Yale, and I thought, wow, that's the way to work with souls. Much more than at a group level where you don't really know that most of the individuals in your congregation, except by name maybe, but you don't really know them in depth. In analysis, you get to know somebody in the greatest depth possible. In our limited ability to know others, to the extent that they let us know them, of course, but analysis over a period of time gives you exposure to the depth of a personality in an extraordinary way. And that's what fascinated me about it so much. And that it values the individual to give them that much time and attention. It's very expensive. Analysis, it's expensive financially, but it's expensive in terms of time. Mm-hmm. I could be doing a podcast with you and talking to 10,000 people, but in analysis, it's one person.
One-to-one.
I spend an hour with them, and I spend an hour with you. But to me...
It's not a very efficient way to change the world, Murray.
No, but you know what? If there were enough analysts changing the world, maybe. Hillman wrote a book, 100 Years of Psychotherapy, and we're not any better off than we were before.
Well, the world's getting worse.
Getting worse.
Yeah.
But you don't know if that's true or not. Is the world really getting worse? Or is it getting better in a strange way?
Well, sometimes you get a little more sick before you get better, right? Before the fever turns, it gets worse.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's interesting. So I think there must have been something in you that was interested in knowing God, leading you to divinity school, but then finding this alternate path where there's more intimacy and understanding, each individual soul as a facet of the great self or God. Would you say that's accurate? And that gave you a little more detail, a little more insight into what you were seeking?
I grew up in a religious family and a religious culture. I enjoyed, I'm very familiar with the Bible. We read Bible stories at breakfast every morning. When I went to Israel a few years ago, it felt like I was in my neighborhood, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, the road to Damascus, all of that. It's so familiar. But I didn't know that I was really searching for God. I think I discovered that later. Theology will not take you to God. We had at Yale Divinity School, it's a very intellectual school. We did have a chapel service every day and good sermons and so on, but it didn't focus on a personal experience of God. It was learning theology, history of theology, ethics. Social action was very important, transforming the world into a more just society, a just place, and so on. But the search for God, it wasn't really in the program. It's when I read Jung that I discovered, there is a way to the what you could call the mystical experience, or the kingdom of God is within, to discover the God within. There is a way to do that. It's experiential. It's not intellectual. And a lot of my fellow students at the divinity school, after they finished or they dropped out, went into other areas, social work, law, politics, so they weren't, you would say, captured by the Spirit through their theological studies. Theology is, abstract. It's based on earlier experience. Apostles experienced something that was explosive, and then later generations thought about it, and every now and then you get mystics along the way, but they weren't really terribly accepted in the church circles. They weren't, the leaders, and mysticism takes people into all kinds of strange directions. So the search for God, I think, is something that you discover maybe as you get older, have a midlife experience. It's a search for meaning. It's a search for what the Quakers call the inner light, maybe something like that. But I think that's, to discover that you're searching for God is a great discovery in itself. Mm-hmm. That puts you on a path, but you have to discover that that's all that you're
There's that
for.
big question, like, well, what am I seeking? I mean, I could say I'm seeking God, but gosh, I mean, that's the unanswerable question, the ineffable. I think like what you're talking about in terms of like when you go to theology, you may go as someone seeking God, and you go and you find out that you're actually learning about ideas of God. Isn't it kind of perfectly encapsulated in the way that they translated Otto's book, which was originally titled The Holy, and when it was translated to English, it was called The Idea of the Holy. It's like,
it's exactly.
we dare not say that we're talking about the thing in itself, but rather we can talk around it. We can talk about ideas of.
That's right.
But anything mystical is like going to be inherently heretical to the orthodoxy. I mean, that's the big that's why you don't go to mysticism school. It's because it would undermine the whole foundation, the whole edifice of the religion.
Organizational structures, they're power structures. They define what's in the canon, what's not in the canon. Mm-hmm. So those were the bishops in the early church, and they created a canon, and they created an orthodoxy, and that's the nature of organizations. And that happened, I don't think that's happened terribly in the Jungian world. I was the president of the International Association for Analytical Psychology, which is the umbrella organization of all the Jungians in the world who belong to Jungian organizations, have trained in institutes and so on. So I traveled a lot. And the Jungians in different countries and different cultures are affected by their environment, their learning, their background, their history. So there is a great variety. But there's been no dogmatization of Jungian thought in the community, in the international community. So we have great diversity and freedom within limits, of course, but the limits being, I would say, human values, human rights is one, and freedom, freedom to explore. Democracy is a big, all the groups are set up in a democratic way, so each individual can speak. So those are basic values. But within that framework, there's a great deal of freedom. So thank God it hasn't come down to a canon. James Hillman was a kind of renegade. He took off on what he called archetypal psychology and rejected a large part of the Jungian framework and practice and language and so on. But it's very fresh, and people accepted that, and he remained a Jungian analyst throughout his life, and contributed, and other analysts read his works and used it. So there was that freedom, and continues to be. And I'm very grateful for that we aren't locked into dogmas, because they're deadly. Of the spirit, they kill the spirit.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. So, but of course, there are individuals who become dogmatic. I mean, it's just kind of part of human nature. It's like, the ego wants something that it can define. It doesn't like fuzzy boundaries. It makes it very uncomfortable.
Too much openness. Yeah. I think that, it's a horror of the vacuum, horror vacui, it's called. That horror of the empty space or the void, which Buddhism treasures,
It's like all about the void. Give me more void.
More void. And Jung appreciated the void. He, I don't know, have you studied the Seven Sermons to the Dead? It's a very interesting.
Well, not studied it, but read it as a curiosity and with a lot of fascination. I mean, just the idea that he produced this little book, which was like kind of a received text apparently, and gave it up to friends. And I mean, that's Jung at his best heretical self.
Yes, a Gnostic text. And he starts out, everything is nothing, nothing is everything. That's the pleroma. There are no distinctions. There are no definitions. That's where everything comes from. It's the great matrix. And then this other process sets in called the creatura that begins individuating, creates opposites, makes definitions. And that's the way things unfold. That's, as you say, it's inevitable that definitions of good and bad and up and down and male and female and all that enter in. But at the point of origin, it's also in Christianity. Paul, says, in Christ we are all one. There's no male and no female, no slave and no free. It's there's this sense of oneness in that pleroma, no definitions, but it can be kind of scary because you don't know what's what. You lose your identity, you lose your certainties about your individuality, you dissolve into the void, and that takes courage to allow that process to happen. That's also part of the way to the self, to dissolve, solutio, and reform in a new way.
Yeah. I mean, coming back to the psychedelic experience, so I had my own experiences with that. Like I mentioned before we started recording, I, right on schedule, age 35, started questioning my life and what I was doing with it, thinking there must be something more, something's off. And so one of the ways that I tried to kind of recover myself was through working with plant medicines in a very kind of intentional and structured way. First within a religious organization, a kind of syncretic Christian church out of Brazil that worked with ayahuasca as the sacrament. And the frustrated Catholic in me was really overjoyed to find, oh my God, like this isn't a tasteless wafer. This actually causes an experience that is like wonderful and mysterious and huge and wow. But one of the things, so then after that, I did start to counsel people who were working with psychedelics, trying to help them navigate and integrate the experience. And I found that like one of the biggest obstacles for people integrating the experience and like grasping it, understanding it, putting it in context, was that there wasn't a kind of mythological and cosmological context from their modern Western upbringing that was big enough to hold the experience. Mm-hmm. And so we had to go to Eastern philosophies. Eventually I found, Jung kind of gives a another kind of context that the Westerner can understand and use in order, something to put these experiences in that helps to for our minds to grasp them or at least work with them. So I found like the function of a good concept or a big enough concept in working with these experiences was absolutely essential and something that we are quite bereft of in our modern culture.
Mhm.
So going back to what you're saying about the concepts about the unconscious, the big self, the shadow, all of that, very useful, but let's make them kind of provisional, like use as needed and don't get too
Yeah.
stuck on them, right?
Right, exactly. I think they're very useful for um, sorting experience and kind of putting it in a place in your life. Um, the there in the 70s in Zurich, Jungian analysts did quite a lot of work with LSD in a clinical setting. Um, uh, his name was Ian Baker. He's now passed away. He was British, but lived in Zurich and under very careful clinical conditions used LSD with patients in the clinic. And they had great experiences, not bad trips mostly, but good experiences and visionary. But he said the problem was integrating the experience. Um, it's so different from our normal cultural experiences. As you say, we live in a Western, secular, materialistic, scientific world around us, and there is no cultural understanding or support for this type of vision. So that split would remain. They could remember that experience, but then they're back in their ordinary lives. It fades with time. They forget it. So the question became how to keep it alive or how to use it, how to renew it. And I think that's where things stand now. I think with ayahuasca, I've talked to a number of people who are quite involved in that Brazilian group also. And there's a collective sense there. There's a group, there's group support for it. Other people have had the experience. It's a little bit like an AA group, We share an experience, we can talk about it, and we support each other in our development. And I think,
Yeah. I was just thinking about that meeting. Like, my name is Brian, and I've had an experience with the numinous. Welcome, Brian. I'll share our experiences.
well, I think if you had that, you'd have a church of the, the reason Christianity succeeded, I think, one of the reasons I was taught at least was that women were included in the church. And they weren't included at the top, but they were included importantly. They're mentioned in the New Testament. They're mentioned with respect. And so families could belong. And it gave it a ground and a basis, a social basis that could survive under severe persecutions. They weren't stamped out.
Yeah.
And they could support each other. If you read Paul's letters to the churches and so on, they're very supportive and instructive, and you love each other and be with each other and be good to each other. All of that supports the spiritual. It's a social grounding for the spiritual. And with analysis, we don't have that. Jung tried it by forming the psychology club in Zurich. He said his analysans, it's so individual in analysis, they need to be able to talk to other people who've had similar experiences. So he formed what's called the Psychology Club. It's still in existence 100 and some years later. And so they would get together and listen to lectures and have some parties together. It was a kind of social organization. And it was very important in Jung's time. He gave most of his great seminars in the club. The club members became analysts. there was a social network around Jung that supported his work and extended his work. And that's what institutes do in various cities. Like in Zurich, we have 2 institutes, and they're communities built around studying and training, and it keeps the work alive. With psychedelics, I don't know if I mean, there are psychedelic churches. I guess there was also what was it? The drug that the American natives used.
Oh, like the peyote, the Native American church.
Peyote cults, yeah, that was a church. Mm-hmm. And there was a Jungian analyst who actually was involved in that cult, and he gave lectures about his peyote experiences and his involvement with the cult. But they use it in a very different way. It's not recreational, and it's for a very special purpose, and it's worshipful. And so I think it's psychedelics could be used for spiritual and sustained spirituality and deepening of spiritual life if there were a community supporting that. Mm-hmm. But individually, it tends to fade pretty quickly. You go back into your family and ordinary life.
Yeah, my feeling is that aside from there being any kind of group that you might belong to that could help to sustain the experience over time, it's up to the individual, I think, to sustain themselves through a spiritual practice that doesn't involve any drugs or. And so I think for me, like that's where I came to is like the way to integrate is to develop a spiritual practice, to have a little corner in your home devoted to spirit, make a little altar in your home and attend to it daily. And in that way, you're attending to the spirit or, the self, to use the Jungian term. I mean, there's something else about, like you mentioned how the community can support you, right? The spiritual community can support you. And that's something that, reading through my grandfather's memoir, we talked a little bit before we started recording. We have a kind of a shared family history in that my great-grandparents came from a Mennonite settlement in the Ukraine during the Russian Revolution and came to Canada when they're giving away, land to be farmed. It wasn't quite farmland yet. They had to put in a lot of work. It wasn't free, but they came over and settled in Mennonite community. And reading his little 10-page typed memoir that was left behind, reading about the kind of struggle that they had to go through during the revolution and being persecuted and all of that, what I realized was how much that their Christian community supported them through incredibly hard times, like things that I can't imagine going through. And so as I was doing my own wrestling with Christianity and this legacy in my life and kind of lack of it in recent generations, I had to at least give it a place of value in my ancestral history. And that one of the reasons why I'm even here is probably has a lot to do with the support that these people got from that Christian community.
Yeah.
And I think about Jung's, his question, like, when you can't support yourself, when you can no longer support yourself, what's there to support you? And I think that's like the spiritual question, like, what is supporting you when everything else is falling apart?
It's such an important question today. I mentioned Leslie Stein's name earlier. We're very good friends and contact with each other a lot. He's done a lot of work on the problem of loneliness in recent years in many cultures, but especially in North America and Europe. Studies have shown, since COVID, especially the pandemic, people cutting off or reducing their social contacts and relationships and so on. And the skyrocketing, really a critical mental health issue of loneliness and how to cope with it. So there are all kinds of strategies for how to do that. But if you are outside of a community and you have strong experiences and you're by yourself, you're at great risk. You're at risk of losing your sanity, so to speak. I mean, um, we depend a lot on for our mental health on communities, not just our physical well-being, but our mental health, which as you get older is especially important. That's why there are communities of older people living together in collectives and so on to keep their minds active and alive. But also your feeling life, your feeling of belonging and being attached. Um, it's not healthy to be isolated. Jung says you can't individuate on Mount Everest. You need people. You need to interact with people, even if they're not pleasant interactions. You're encountering another. And that's what churches are good for, temples, community centers. And I think that's very important aspect to certainly these pioneers. My grandfather was 6 years old when they came to Canada from Prussia. And the first winter they lived underground in a hole that they dug and put a tarpaulin over it. And then they had to start clearing the land. But there was a community. It was the Anabaptists, and they all helped each other build buildings, and like the Amish, oh, we need to build a new barn. Everybody gets together and builds a barn. So these communities are very resilient and sustainable. I think the world has to become a community. We have to help people all in other cultures and not see the other as enemy, but as fellow human beings. We all need each other and can help each other spiritually, physically, mentally. Diane's dream, which I'm sure you'll talk about when you interview her, invites people into her fifth floor room to come and sit there, meditate, contemplate. You put your finger on a very important point, that to sustain these types of spiritual experiences, you need a practice. In Jungian work, we use active imagination. I do it most every day. I do it often by walking or during walking or with music, but it is an experience of being with your inner self and sustaining that sense of self, that inner world feeling that we construct or work with and work into doing active imagination. That has to be maintained or it'll fall apart and decay and disappear.
It feels like, to me, it's like I would say I worked in ayahuasca healing center in Peru for a little while. And so people would come from all over the world for a week or a month, depending, to do a retreat, to do some deep work. And I was there to support them by doing, like giving them a yoga practice every morning and maybe doing a little bit of music and things like that, kind of light facilitation or light support. But I would say to people when they come, it's like it feels like such an intense experience that you'll never forget while you're here and while it's fresh. But I said every step you take away from this retreat center, that experience will start to dissipate.
Yeah.
Trust me on that. And the closer you get back to civilization, the faster it's going to dissipate, and because like the influence of our modern technological world is so strong that we have to become like a kind of a spiritual warrior in order to maintain contact with the numinous, the other world, the unconscious, whatever.
Yeah. And with other people who've had that experience and form networks, and you can do that online. I'm in touch with a lot of people online. We can share experiences, and so the internet is a wonderful invention if we use it correctly. It can connect us to people all around the world. So I'm very happy to do this podcast with you, Brian. I'm going to have to stop, and maybe I'll see you again sometime.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate you taking the time with me. It's been really nice to speak with you. And we didn't get into any of the specifics about the book, but I think we talked about the subjects of the book
Subject. Yes.
in a way that felt very real and alive for me. So I appreciate that.
Good. Very nice getting to know you, a fellow Canadian.
Yeah, I had no idea, but nice to meet you. Take care.
Here. Bye bye.
Bye, Murray.